In a war of world firsts, Ukraine just pulled off another. Near St. Petersburg lies the Kronstadt Naval Base, the official headquarters of Russia's Baltic Fleet, a base that was supposed to be untouchable. Then, Ukraine came knocking. Well, scratch that, Ukraine blew the base to pieces in an overnight drone raid that sends a clear message to Putin. Russia's most protected naval port is now a target. And to hammer the point home, Ukraine hit something in Kronstadt that Russia will never be able to replace. We'll get to what that is soon. First, the strike. It was massive, and it's the latest sign that Ukraine has delivered that there is nothing in Russia that is safe from the country's drones. The War Zone, or TWZ, has the details in a June 3rd report. Overnight, Ukraine's drones flew hundreds of miles to arrive at the Kronstadt Naval Base. This isn't any old base. It's among the most prestigious of all Russia's naval assets, and it's located in a city that is both Putin's hometown and the jewel in the crown of Russia in terms of the image that Putin wants to display to the world. That jewel has just been tarnished by Ukraine's drones, and Putin has the first separate center of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces to thank. That unit coordinated the entire strike, and we can deduce how based on a few interesting factors. First, there's footage from the strike. That tells us that there was either a local operator somewhere on the ground near Russia's naval base who was directing traffic, indicating that Ukraine has drone operators working outside of its own territory, or the drones Ukraine used operated using a SATCOM link, meaning that Russian electronic warfare completely failed to stop the drones in their tracks. Neither scenario is good for Putin. Both tell him that the supposedly untouchable Kronstadt base isn't as protected as he thought. Other possibilities are that Ukraine used short-range drones for its attack on Russia's naval base. That seems unlikely. It would require Ukraine to have sent a mothership of some kind into the waters around the base to unleash the drones. Ukraine has that capability. Images have already started circulating of Ukraine transforming an aeropract A-32 light sport aircraft into a drone-carrying destroyer. And on May 26th, Forbes reported that Ukraine has adapted some of its naval drones, so they're now capable of transporting FPV drones to a target ahead of an attack. Whatever the specific method used, the results are the same. The first separate center of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces just struck a base that was supposed to be out of reach. And while there, those drones just happened to destroy something that Russia can't replace. Before we get to that, a few more details about the Kronstadt Naval Base reveal why it's so impressive that Ukraine was able to hit this target. United 24 Media points out that the base has long served as one of Russia's most important naval strongholds, and that it's one of two key bases that Russia's Baltic Fleet uses to try to maintain control over the Baltic Sea. Located about 20 kilometers away from St. Petersburg, the base is supposed to be heavily protected. It provides Russia with a clear route into the Gulf of Finland, which in turn allows Russia to maintain an ever-present threat against NATO's eastern flank. Russia uses the base to host corvettes, patrol vessels and support ships, and it just so happens to have repair and maintenance facilities to help keep the Baltic Fleet afloat. Keep those facilities in mind, we'll be coming back to them soon. Perhaps the biggest role that Kronstadt plays for Russia is that it's a gatekeeper base. Any naval threat that attempts to reach Russia via the Baltic Sea first has to pass by this base. That more than anything else is why it's so important to Russia. If Kronstadt is taken offline, Russia's defenses weaken. Putin can't afford that. Russia's strongman leader is desperate to project power, especially as Russia's spring and summer offensives in Ukraine falter. If Ukraine is hitting a base that is supposed to stop a Baltic invasion of Russia, that shows the world that Russia is vulnerable. But then Ukraine has made exposing Putin a speciality in recent months. We saw that on June 3rd, as Kronstadt Naval Base was far from the only target in St. Petersburg that felt the wrath of Ukraine's drones. Ukraine's Baltic blasts were just part of a wider campaign in St. Petersburg that seems to have been designed to humiliate Putin. Elsewhere in the city, Ukraine struck against the St. Petersburg oil terminal, which is one of Russia's largest oil export hubs. That terminal plays a crucial role in Russian logistics and fuel exports, CNN reports, so the loss of it will cause major problems for Putin's patsies on the front. However, the St. Petersburg strikes weren't just about hurting Russia's naval assets and oil infrastructure. The timing was immaculate. Ukraine's drones touched down on the very same day that St. Petersburg was set to host the start of the multi-day St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. The annual event, which has been called the Russian Davos, welcomes thousands of attendees from all across the world, and it traditionally hosts Putin as a keynote speaker toward the end of the event. June 3rd was supposed to be a day when St. Petersburg was a beacon of Russian economic power. Instead, it became a day when smoke filled the air and all of the talk would have been about Ukraine's drones rather than Putin's attempts to build economic relationships. Russia's leader has just been left with egg on his face. He'll likely still appear at the forum, but he can't escape the embarrassment that Ukraine just inflicted upon him. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed that Ukraine was behind this latest series of strikes. There are positive results from our long-range strikes carried out by soldiers of the SSU, the Unmanned Systems Forces, the Special Operations Forces, the Defense Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and the State Border Guard Service, Zelensky declared in the aftermath. He focused on the St. Petersburg oil terminal, though Ukraine's president also made a vague statement that purely military targets at the Kronstadt base were also hit. That's an understatement. The reality is that what happened in Kronstadt is the headliner of Ukraine's St. Petersburg strikes. And the reason why comes down to something very specific that is up in flames due to Ukraine's drones. That something is irreplaceable for Russia, and it has in the past played a key role in ensuring that the Shadow Fleet ships sailing through the Baltic get to their destinations. But before we reveal what Ukraine hit in Kronstadt, we have a quick side note. You are watching The Military Show, and we bring you the full story, not just the headlines. If you're enjoying what you're watching, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss one of our videos. Nestled deep within the Kronstadt Naval Base was a ship. A Russian corvette named the Boiky was undergoing repairs at the base ahead of being sent back out into the Baltic, where it could continue to pose the threat that Putin wants to create in the region. That isn't going to happen anymore. Russia's ship may have been hidden in a supposedly impenetrable base, but Ukraine found it, and the country's drones hit the ship hard. The commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brovdy, has provided footage that shows Ukraine hit exactly what it intended to hit at Kronstadt on June 3rd. The footage is shot from the perspective of the incoming drones, as TWZ explained, and it shows that not one, but two of Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles scored direct hits on the Boiky. To manage those hits, Ukraine's drones had to penetrate deep enough into the Kronstadt base to reach the base's dry dock, presumably overcoming Russian air defenses in the process. And what we see as the drones hit their targets are explosions that indicate that Russia's corvette isn't going to be sailing again anytime soon. It's the second strike that appears to have done all the damage. In its report on Ukraine's Baltic strike, Euromaidan Press says that Ukraine's second drone scored a direct hit on the center of Russia's corvette, sparking a massive fire on the Boikyy's bridge. But the fire isn't the big news. Ukraine aimed for the center mass because that part of the Boiky is where all of the most expensive and important electronics that the warship uses are located. Russia's corvette has a Furka-2 airborne surveillance radar that has just gone up in flames due to Ukraine's drones. It also has electronic warfare systems, navigational systems, and a Monument A guided missile radar, all of which are stored in the precise location that Ukraine's drones just hit. Ukraine may not have sunk the Boiky, but it may as well have done. Without that equipment, the ship is practically dead in the water, at least in terms of its usefulness to the Baltic Fleet. The Boiky can no longer see, and it's lost the equipment that was supposed to help it stop attacks like this in the first place. It's a sitting duck, an already broken ship that has just been taken completely out of commission for who knows how long. Satellite images that have emerged from the scene show us that Russia doesn't have a hope of hiding the damage. Those pictures show fire crews trying to put out the blaze on the ship. Both the bridge and the tower are blackened by the fire and appear to have partially collapsed. Oh, and it's not like the water being used to put out the fire is going to be all that great for any of the electronic components on the Boiky center that managed to survive the fire that Ukraine's drones caused. Russia has a lot of corvette repairs in its future. The odds are high at this point that it may give up on the Boiky altogether, especially if the damage that Ukraine's drones caused proves to be more extensive than we've seen so far. For Russia, the loss of the Boiky will be a major problem for the country's Baltic posture. At its peak, this is a dangerous ship. The vessel is one of Russia's most modern, as it's one of the Project 20380 Steregushi-class corvettes that Russia designed to be a jack-of-all-trades on the water. The Boiky is supposed to be able to deal with surface, submarine, and aerial threats, and it's been in service with the Baltic Fleet since 2013. The reason it was at the Kronstadt Naval Base in the first place had nothing to do with it being damaged in the line of duty. The Boiky entered the base in February for routine repairs after more than a decade spent at sea. What was supposed to be a quick patch-up has been turned into a nightmare for Russia. The floating host of 100mm guns, Kh-35 anti-ship missiles, and a Redoubt air defense system is going to be spending a lot longer in Kronstadt than Russia anticipated. As damaging as this will be for the Baltic Fleet, it's even more of a problem for the Shadow Fleet vessels that are traveling through the Baltic, carrying oil that Russia sells to other countries. Brovdy claims that the Boiky had an enchanting history of travel and venture along NATO borders, accompanying the Shadow Fleet. In other words, the ship provided a military escort to the shady tankers that Russia has been using, both to transport oil and gas and to conduct hybrid warfare against NATO nations that extends to sabotaging undersea cables and launching drones that fly into NATO territory. So the loss of the Boiky isn't just bad news for Russia, it's a boon for NATO as it tries to curtail Russia's use of the Shadow Fleet to skirt sanctions. That fleet means everything to Putin. According to the Royal United Services Institute, Russia has spent at least $14 billion to create its fleet of shady ships, and it's generated many billions of dollars more in oil revenue from their service. Japan Forward said that taxes on the revenue that these ships generate provide as much as 40% of Putin's Ukraine war budget. Cripple the Shadow Fleet, and Putin's war machine falls apart. Taking out a corvette that helps to protect Putin's decrepit tankers is a big step. What Ukraine has just done here isn't just humiliating for Russia, it creates opportunities for Shadow Fleet ship seizures in the future. We've already seen NATO nations start to step up their game when it comes to taking Putin's oil vessels off the water. Just 2 days before Ukraine's Baltic strike, the news broke that France had intercepted an oil tanker named the Tagor around 400 nautical miles off its Atlantic coast, and there have been several other interceptions besides, all of which have stung Putin's Shadow Fleet. Now that Boiky isn't available to ward off potential interceptors, we may start to see more Shadow Fleet vessels being captured. Perhaps the seeds of a new strategy have just been planted. Ukraine shatters Russia's Baltic Fleet, and the country's partners start stopping more of the Shadow Fleet from selling oil. Russia will want to replace the Boiky as soon as possible, but therein lies a major problem. The ship is practically irreplaceable. Russia only built 6 of the Project 20380 ships in the first place, and it doesn't seem to be building any more. If Putin is going to send a comparable corvette into the Baltic Sea, he's going to have to do it by weakening another part of the Russian Navy. And depending on just how extensive the damage done by Ukraine's drones is, Russia may not be able to repair the Boiky that now sits stricken in its most important Baltic base. The electronics that Ukraine hit are a concern in their own right. As Russia creaks under the weight of tens of thousands of Western sanctions, it will likely find it very difficult to get its hands on replacement components for those electronics. However, there's another element at play here: Ukraine. Specifically, Ukraine's shipbuilders. Despite being one of the newer additions to Russia's navy, the Project 20380 is far from an ultra-modern ship. Euromaidan press reveals that the vessel has inefficient engines and poor propulsion systems, suggesting that Russia has attempted to blend Soviet-era technology with more electronics to create a class of corvettes that appear more modern than they really are. Now take a guess at which country was building the engines that are used in the Project 20380 corvettes right up until 2014. It was Ukraine. And ever since Russia began its initial campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014, there have been no new Project 20380 engines flowing into Putin's navy. Combine that with the fact that Russia's shipbuilding industry is now a complete mess. Defense 24 points out that most of Russia's navy is made up of Soviet-era warships, and the demand for new vessels is so high that Russia's shipbuilders can't come close to fulfilling it. Russia doesn't help itself here. Almost all of the funds dedicated to the country's navy are poured into the development of nuclear-powered submarines, leaving surface ships sorely underfunded. If Ukraine has managed to take out the Boiky's engine, that will mean only one thing: Russia's corvette will never sail in the Baltic again. When we said that Ukraine had hit something irreplaceable, that's what we meant. It's not that the Boiky is such a marvel of modern technology that Russia would be hard-pressed to replicate the ship. Rather, Russia's shipbuilding and naval funding are both in such shambles that a ship that might otherwise be fairly easy to replace or repair will instead have to languish in the dry dock of a naval base for months, if not years. That's yet another humiliation for Putin after his St. Petersburg disaster. And that brings us nicely to why Ukraine's Baltic strikes matter so much. As great as it is that Ukraine has just taken out a Baltic Fleet warship, it's the symbolism that really matters for Ukraine. As Putin tried to kick off one of the most important economic and geopolitical events in the Russian calendar, talk of the town wouldn't have been the deals being made, but the plumes of smoke, raging fires, and crippled ships just a few kilometers away. What Ukraine has done is serve up a timely reminder that the war that Putin started has just come back to Russia. There's no escaping it, and despite Zelensky claiming that Ukraine doesn't follow where Putin is going in the aftermath of the St. Petersburg strikes, there's no denying the timing on display here. This was not a coincidence. Ukraine chose the perfect time to take out the Boiky. But as he tries to wipe the egg off his face, Putin's much bigger concern now is that a new front has opened up in the war. The Baltic region, which for so many years has been safe from Ukraine's strikes, is now open for business. With this attack, Ukraine has proven that its drones can fly hundreds of kilometers into one of the most protected regions of Russia and still score direct hits. More will be coming. Ukraine's main intelligence directorate says that the country now has drones that can fly up to 3,500 kilometers. which is deep enough to put Russia's Far East in the firing line. Nowhere is safe in Russia anymore, and that will terrify Putin. He can't just attack Ukraine at range in the belief that there will be no reprisals. That's especially the case in the Baltic Sea. For years, Ukraine has focused its efforts on what is supposed to be Russia's naval advantage in the Black Sea. Ukraine succeeded. About a third of the Black Sea fleet has been taken out of commission, and the rest has sailed away to hidey holes, becoming a non-factor along the way. Now that the Black Sea is under control, the Baltic Sea is on the agenda. A new northern front has been opened, hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines in Ukraine. Any Baltic Fleet ships that enter port now do so knowing that there is a risk that Ukraine's drones will pay them a visit. Shadow Fleet ships will face the same risk. Every time they try to fill up, they do so knowing the oil they carry may end up burning. Putin now has a Baltic Sea dilemma. The untouchable has become a target, and there's nothing that Putin can do about it other than try to build up more of the defenses that have just proven that they can't do a thing to stop Ukraine's drones. While the Boiky burns and St. Petersburg comes to grips with being in the firing line, Putin has even more issues in the Baltic region. Russia's president took things too far with his threat to the Baltic nations. Now, NATO is doing something massive on Russia's border in response. The Baltic defense line is getting stronger, and it's going to ruin Putin's future plans for an invasion of Europe. Find out how by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to The Military Show to see more coverage of Ukraine's lethal deep strike strategy. And thank you for watching.